To understand the American West, you must first imagine the land itself. It was not gentle, not forgiving. It stretched out in endless horizons. Deserts where the sun scorched the earth until it cracked like pottery. Prairies that rolled like an ocean of grass. Mountains jagged as teeth, and canyons carved deep as wounds. The land was magnificent, yes, but also cruel. Rain came seldom, and when it did, it sometimes came as flood. Winters could kill with blizzards, summers with thirst. Rattlesnakes coiled in shadows, coyotes howled at night, and wolves followed travelers for miles. For those who dreamed of freedom and fortune, the West offered space beyond measure. But every step across it was a gamble with nature itself. One of the greatest enemies was thirst. Rivers ran dry in summer, and many streams the maps promised were nothing but dust. Travelers learned to read the land for hidden springs, the green of willows, the track of animals, the coolness of shaded rocks. A mistake could mean death. Food was no less uncertain. Hunting gave meat, but game was not always plentiful. Some settlers roasted prairie dogs, some boiled cactus roots. Others lived for days on jerky and hope. Women gathered wild berries and dug roots while guarding children from snakes. The land demanded cunning, patience, and courage. It punished the careless. Samuel Carter was a young man when he left Missouri with a wagon train. He dreamed of owning land, of building a farm where his children might thrive. But dreams weighed less than water. One summer, their train entered the desert. The sun hammered down. Their barrels ran low. Horses drooped, tongues swollen. The map promised a stream, but when they reached it, there was only sand. Panic spread. Families whispered of turning back, but Samuel, stubborn, searched alone. He watched the sky for birds, followed their flight until he found a grove of cottonwoods. Beneath the trees, he dug, and at last muddy water seeped up. The others rushed to drink, crying, laughing, some even on their knees. That night they camped with relief, yet also fear, for the desert had taught them how thin the line was between life and death. Samuel would later tell his grandchildren, land gives nothing for free. You must earn every drop, every grain. And sometimes, even that is not enough. For pioneers, the West was not only a place to survive, but a teacher that shaped their lives. It taught humility, that men were small before storms. It taught unity, that neighbors must share water, or all would perish. It taught patience, that crops took years to root in new soil. Some learned and endured. Others turned back, broken. The land did not care. It remained vast, merciless, and beautiful, a stage where human hope and human folly played out again and again. The land was the first challenge, and from it all else followed. Once pioneers endured the dust, the heat, the storms, they found themselves at the edges of civilization where little towns sprouted like fragile plants. In a hostile desert, these frontier towns were made of timber and hope, thrown together by men and women who had come west seeking survival or fortune. The streets were not paved, but dusty trails that became rivers of mud and rain. Wooden storefronts leaned under the sun, their signs promising goods that might or might not exist. A saloon was always among the first buildings raised, its swinging doors inviting both cowboys and outlaws, gamblers and drifters. Beside it stood a general store where flour, salt, bullets, and sometimes even a newspaper could be bought for prices. That rose with every mile away from the railroad. Life in these towns was precarious. A single fire could wipe out half the buildings. A gang of outlaws might ride in and empty the bank before vanishing into the horizon. Yet, people stayed. They planted roots in dust, married, gave birth, buried their dead. The sound of a hammer on wood, the creak of wagons, the cry of a newborn, all were signs that civilization fought to grow here. Fragile but persistent, among the dust and noise, individuals wrote their own stories. One was Clara Jennings, a widow who arrived with only 2 children and a mule. She opened a boarding house with 3 rooms and a kitchen, cooking beans and cornbread for miners and travelers. Some nights her guests were lawmen, other nights thieves. Clara never asked too many questions. She charged a fair price, and in return, the men respected her home. Years later, townsfolk would say Clara's kitchen smelled like safety, and a place where bullets flew and promises broke. The smell of fresh bread was its own kind of law. But towns were not the whole of the West. Beyond their edges, cattle stretched like waves across the prairie. Cowboys, young men often no older than 20, lived half their lives in the saddle, driving herds north to railheads. They slept under the stars, ate beans from 10 plates, and guarded against stampedes that could trample a man into the earth. For cowboys, loneliness was as constant as dust. They sang low songs at night to calm the cattle and themselves. One boy, named Miguel, left New Mexico to ride with a Texas outfit. He was only 17, his hat too big for his head, his boots borrowed from an uncle. The trail hardened him. He learned to rope, to ride through storms, to stay awake through long watches. He missed his mother's cooking, but in time, he found family in the saddle beside him. When the herd reached Dodge City, Miguel looked at the crowded streets with wonder. "I brought life here," he told himself, thinking of the beef that would fill so many tables. For all his aching bones, he stood taller than when he began. Yet, not every dreamer came for cattle. Some came with pans and picks, chasing gold. Mining camps rose like mushrooms after rain, full of tents, rough cabins, and desperate men. Gold fever could drive a man to madness, make friends into rivals, brothers into enemies. Few struck it rich. Most struck only blisters and despair. Still, hope glittered in every flake found at the bottom of a pan. There was the story of Patrick O'Malley, an Irish immigrant. He left his family in Boston with promises of riches. In California, he dug until his hands bled, washing gravel day after day. For months, he found nothing but stones. Then, one morning, he pulled a nugget no larger than a walnut from the stream. His heart thundered. That night, he drank away half his fortune in the saloon, buying rounds for strangers, singing songs of home. By dawn, thieves had taken the rest. Patrick returned to his claim poorer than before, but he laughed bitterly. The West gives you a taste, just enough to keep you digging. He never found another nugget, but he stayed, because the dream was harder to bury than gold itself. Law was thin across these lands. A sheriff might carry a badge, but often he was just one man against many. Outlaws rode in groups, guns on hips, ready to take by force what others built by sweat. Some towns hired marshals, others relied on vigilantes. Justice was swift, sometimes cruel. A man could be tried and hanged in the same afternoon. Sheriff Elias Grant knew this too well. In one small Kansas town, he faced a gang of 6 who rode in, shot the bank clerk, and claimed the streets as theirs. Elias was alone, his deputy dead from the first shots. But the sheriff refused to flee. He stepped into the dust, rifle in hand, his boots sinking into the street. One by one, the gang fell. When the smoke cleared, Elias still stood, bleeding from his shoulder, but alive. The townsfolk never forgot. They said Elias was not a man, but a wall, holding back chaos with nothing but his will. All of this towns, cowboys, miners, sheriffs was tied together by families on lonely homesteads. These were the backbone of the West, men and women who carved farms from wild land. They built sod houses with walls of earth, grew corn in soil that resisted, and prayed for rain that sometimes never came. Women labored not only in kitchens but in fields, shouldering rifles when wolves came. Nursing children by candlelight. Margaret Thompson was one such woman. With her husband, she settled on a plot of land granted by the Homestead Act. Their cabin leaked in the first storm. Their crops withered in the first drought. Margaret nearly gave up, but she pressed on, teaching her children to read from a single Bible. The first time a train reached a frontier town, people gathered as if to see a miracle. Children pressed close. Women covered their ears against the scream of the whistle. Old men removed their hats in awe. The earth trembled beneath the wheels, sparks flew, and suddenly the distance between one town and another seemed smaller. The railroad was a road of iron, but also a road of change. Not everyone welcomed it. Ranchers cursed the sparks that set grass ablaze. Hunters mourned the vanishing buffalo herds, driven away by smoke and noise. Native tribes saw rails cut through hunting grounds like scars across sacred land. Yet, the train came on, mile after mile, until the frontier was pierced with steel. Among those who built it were thousands of laborers, many of them Chinese immigrants. They worked with picks and dynamite, clinging to cliff sides, blasting tunnels through mountains. Their pay was little, their danger immense. Some never returned from avalanches or explosions. But without them, the dream of a railroad would have remained only a dream. One worker, Li Wei, left Guangdong with promises of fortune. He learned instead the language of dynamite. In the Sierra Nevada, he swung his hammer 12 hours a day, the cold biting through his thin clothes. Once, an explosion buried half his crew. Li Wei crawled from rubble, his hands bleeding, his eyes full of dust. He buried friends with no family near to mourn them. Yet he stayed. When the final spike was driven, he touched it with his calloused hand and whispered, "This is our blood in the steel." With trains came more people, more goods, more lie and more greed. Towns that once saw only dust now saw silk, whiskey, rifles, newspapers. But also came men with faster guns, bankers with faster tricks, and speculators who bought land from settlers only to sell it dear. Progress carried a sharp edge. The coming of the train also changed how nights felt. Before, when the sun dropped, the frontier belonged to shadows. Coyotes howled, wolves prowled, and people gathered near firelight, whispering prayers against the dark. Now whistles split the silence, lamps glowed in depots, and the world seemed smaller. Yet fear remained. Night was still a place of danger. Outlaws rode at dusk, striking when streets emptied. Wolves still came in winters, thin and desperate, and above all lingered superstition. Some swore they saw ghost riders galloping across the prairie, or heard the wails of lost miners in the canyons. Belief in spirits was not weakness, it was survival. A way to explain the dangers no bullet could kill. There was a story told of a night watchman named Henry Cobb in a Colorado town. His job was to patrol empty streets, lantern in hand. One winter night, he swore he saw a tall figure in white standing by the well. When he called, the figure vanished, leaving only the sound of water dripping. The townsfolk said it was the ghost of a drowned woman. Henry never walked by the well again, but each night he still carried his lantern. Whether ghosts or men, he said, light is the only answer. From such tales grew the legends of the West. Some were born of truth, others of whiskey, most of both. Gunfighters became giants in stories, their duels described as if thunder itself clashed. Outlaws who robbed a stagecoach once were remembered as clever folk heroes a generation later. Even sheriffs, hardened men of dust and grit, became myths after death. The line between man and legend blurred until children could no longer tell the difference. Take the tale of Belstar, the so-called bandit queen. Some said she rode with Jesse James. Others claimed she led her own gang. In truth, she was a woman who lived hard and died young, shot in the back on a lonely road. But the songs made her immortal. With silver pistols at her side and a crown of rebellion on her brow, or consider Wild Bill Hickok, a gambler and gunman whose eyes were said to pierce through lies. He was shot from behind while playing cards, holding aces and eights the dead man's hand. In death he became larger than life. The West itself distilled into one tragic figure. Death was never far in the frontier. Graves dotted hillsides, wooden crosses leaning in the wind. Some were marked with names, others with nothing but stones. Families buried their own, sometimes without priests, sometimes in haste as wolves circled nearby. Yet even in death, memory clung. Songs were sung, prayers whispered, stories told to children so that those lost would not vanish entirely. A gravedigger in Arizona once carved into a rough plank, Here lies a man who wanted more. No name, no date. The story passed through saloons and camps. Was he a miner, a gambler, a drifter? No one knew. But the words spoke for half the West. And still, through death, through struggle, there was song. Around campfires, cowboys strummed guitars, miners hummed Irish tunes. Women sang lullabies that crossed oceans. Music and story were the true gold of the West, treasures that could not be stolen. The seasons themselves sang their own verses. Spring brought floods that swept away cabins. Summer baked the land until cattle collapsed. Autumn laid barns with grain or left them bare, and winter froze streams solid. To live here was to bow to the rhythm of earth. A farmer's hope rose and fell with clouds. A rancher's wealth with grass. Nature was master, and people her stubborn students. One woman, Hannah Price, kept a diary through a year on the plains. She wrote of planting corn in spring, of dust storms that stripped her fields in summer, of harvests that filled only half a bin in autumn, and of children shivering in winter nights. But we endure. She ended each season. Her diary survived long after her cabin rotted, proof that words could outlast wood. So the West was more than guns and gold, more than saloons and sheriffs. It was land and loss, courage and folly, dreams broken and reborn. It was a place where every sunrise promised both danger and possibility. And though the frontier is long since closed, its spirit lingers, a shadow stretching across the American soul. The West was a land of beginnings and endings, a place where every sunrise carried both promise and threat. For those who dared to settle it, life was not measured in years but in struggle survived. A man might leave his home in the East with pockets full of hope, and arrive at the frontier with nothing but dust on his boots and scars in his heart. Yet still, they came. Children of the frontier knew little of comfort. They grew up among wagons, rifles, and chores that hardened their hands before they learned to write their names. A boy of 10 could ride bareback and herd cattle. A girl of 12 might cook for 10 men and patch clothes by lantern light. Play existed, but it was rough. Stick horses, marbles of polished stone, hide and seek between cabins. Laughter was brief, for work always returned. Still, children carried light in their eyes. They made pets of stray dogs, named every horse, carved toys from scraps of wood. Their world was harsh, but their imagination softened it. One settler wrote in his journal of his daughter Sarah, who drew pictures in the dirt with a stick. She sees gardens in dust, he marveled, and castles where I see only fences. Women of the West bore burdens as great as any man. They were midwives, teachers, farmers, sometimes fighters. When husbands rode for supplies or cattle drives, women defended homesteads with rifles propped by the door. Many gave birth alone, biting leather straps against the pain, praying both mother and child would live. One such woman, Rebecca Lane, was left alone with her two young sons while her husband chased work on the railroad. When raiders threatened her farm, she hid the children under the floorboards and stood in the doorway with a shotgun. The raiders passed her by, perhaps sensing iron in her stance. When her husband returned months later, Rebecca simply said, "The land doesn't wait for you." Faith was another pillar. On Sundays, towns gathered in rough chapels built of logs, where preachers thundered against sin and promised salvation. Hymns lifted voices over the plains, mixing with the wind. For settlers, religion was both shield and comfort, explaining why droughts came, why children died, why fortune turned to ruin. And alongside faith lived superstition, charms against snake bites, stories of spirits and canyons, whispered warnings about crossing rivers at night. There was a preacher named Josiah Boone who traveled from town to town on horseback, Bible in his saddlebag. He spoke not only of heaven, but of entrance. The Lord gives you the land, he told farmers, but he also gives you the sweat to work it. People remembered his voice long after he passed, saying he carried hope like water in a dry land. As decades passed, the West began to change. Barbed wire cut across open range, ending the freedom of cattle drives. Towns grew into cities with brick buildings and paved streets. The old saloons became hotels. The dirt roads became railways. The frontier spirit did not die, but it was buried beneath progress. Cowboys became hired hands. Miners became factory workers. Sheriffs became policemen with rules to follow. But legends outlived reality. Around campfires and in print, stories grew taller. Gunfights became epic duels. Desperados became folk heroes. And women who held homes together were painted as queens of the prairie. The truth was harsher, but the legend was sweeter. And sometimes, legends tell us more about what people wished than what they endured in the end. What remains of the West is not just dust and memory. It is the echo of hoofbeats in American history, the whistle of trains, the courage of ordinary people whose names are lost but whose struggles shaped the nation. Every grave, every abandoned cabin, every faded trail still whispers, "We lived here. We endured. We dreamed." And that whisper carries forward long after the last campfire faded, long after the frontier closed. The West endures not as a place of geography, but as a place in the imagination, where every dawn can still feel like the first, and every horizon still promises something just out of reach. The marketplace was the beating heart of every frontier town, no matter how small or dusty. It might have been nothing more than a row of tents beside a saloon, or a handful of wagons gathered in a square of packed earth. Yet here, for a few hours each week, life pulsed with color, sound, and possibility. Merchants laid out their goods, bolts of cloth brought from St. Louis, tin pans and kettles hammered in Pennsylvania, rifles with polished barrels, sacks of flour, barrels of whiskey, and sometimes, if one was lucky, a crate of oranges or coffee that had traveled farther than most men ever would. The air smelled of horse sweat, frying meat, and tobacco smoke. Townsfolk came not just to buy, but to meet. Farmers traded corn for nails. Cowboys spent their wages on boots or drink. Women bargained fiercely over fabric to make Sunday dresses. Children ran between wagons, eyes wide at the treasures on display. A painted toy, a bright ribbon, a pocket knife gleaming in the sun. But the marketplace was also a stage for stories. Every peddler carried not only goods, but tales, news from the east, rumors of gold strikes, warnings of bandits, whispers of war. For many settlers, this was the only thread that tied them to the wider world. Elias Turner had been a school teacher once, back in Ohio, but wanderlust gnawed at him, and he traded his chalkboard for a wagon. He filled it with pots, needles, spools of thread, knives, and small luxuries like peppermint sticks and penny-paper novels. With his mule, Daisy, he traveled from town to town, never staying long. Elias became a familiar sight on the roads. Children chased after his wagon, calling, "What stories today, Elias?" For he always had some to tell. About a steamboat sinking on the Mississippi, or a duel fought in Texas, or a circus he once saw with lions and acrobats. Yet his life was not without danger. Once, on the trail between Dodge City and Abilene, bandits stopped him. They wanted his goods, and perhaps his life. Elias, trembling, offered them a barrel of flour and a box of knives. The leader laughed, but something in Elias's nervous chatter amused him. He let the peddler go, saying, "You're worth more alive, with your tongue, than dead." That night, Elias wrote in his journal, "The road is my home, the people my pupils, and my stories my wages." A man does not need land to belong, he needs only to be remembered. Years later, when Elias died of fever in a boarding house, towns across the plains mourned. Children who had grown to adults still remembered the peppermint sticks, the bright ribbons, and the man who made the dusty roads feel like pathways to wonder. The road itself was both lifeline and curse. Without it, towns withered. With it, dangers multiplied. Stagecoaches rattled across ruts so deep wheels snapped. Dust storms blinded travelers. In spring, Swollen rivers swept away wagons. And always, there was the threat of violence. Outlaws haunted the trails, their names spreading like wildfire. A man could ride into a town at sunset, smiling, and by morning be known as a thief who had robbed a coach 100 miles away. Law traveled slower than rumor, and often slower than the guns of bandits. There was the gang of Red Jack Kearney, who painted their faces with clay before striking. They stopped a coach once carrying a preacher, 3 women, and a trunk of hymn books. Red Jack laughed and made the preacher sing a psalm at gunpoint, then stole only the horses, leaving the Bibles behind. For years afterward, travelers swore they heard hymns echoing from canyons whenever the wind blew. But despite danger, marketplaces flourished. They were not only for trade, but for performance. Musicians with battered fiddles played reels, gamblers set up tables under canvas roofs, and traveling showmen dazzled children with sleight of hand. One summer, a man called Professor Aldous arrived with a battered wagon painted with stars. He claimed he could summon spirits. For a fee, he held seances in the back of his wagon, where he made tables shake and voices whisper from the shadows. Some believed, some laughed, but all paid. When autumn came, he vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving only rumors and wonder behind. The marketplace gave people not just goods, but stories to carry home. Stories became as valuable as flour or coffee, for they gave settlers something beyond survival, imagination, for all its dangers. The road was also freedom. It carried the brave and the desperate, the hopeful and the broken. It carried news, goods, letters, and dreams. An old cowboy once said, "The land breaks you, the town keeps you, but the road teaches you what you are." And so the road stretched on, endless, tying together dust-choked towns, lonely farms, and wild horizons. Each wagon track carved in the earth was a reminder. Someone passed here, chasing something more. The West was not only built by farmers and merchants, it was haunted by shadows. For every church steeple, there was a saloon. For every sheriff, a desperado. Outlaws thrived where law was thin, where the nearest marshal might be 100 miles away, and where a gun was often quicker than a writ. They rode in gangs. Their names whisper like storms: the Daltons, the James brothers, the Regulators. Some robbed for greed, some for revenge, some simply because they could not live any other way. In the lawless stretches of prairie and canyon, they were both terror and legend, feared and admired in equal measure. Among the tales was that of Red Mary O'Hara, a woman with hair like fire and eyes that glinted with steel. Born in a mining camp in Colorado, she grew up with no mother and a drunken father who taught her to shoot before she could read. When he was killed in a bar fight, Mary vanished into the hills. Months later, rumors spread of a red-haired bandit leading raids on stagecoaches. Mary's gang was small but fierce. They robbed gold shipments, whiskey wagons, and once even held up a train. Witnesses swore she rode at the front, pistol in each hand. Laughing as the engineer brought the iron beast to a halt, the law hunted her, but the hills protected her. For years, she slipped away after each raid, her legend growing with every escape. Mothers warned children not to wander at night, or Red Mary will take you. Yet in saloons, men toasted her name, half in fear, half in admiration. Her end came not by the bullet of a sheriff, but by betrayal. One of her own men, lured by the promise of a pardon, led her into an ambush. They said she died with a pistol still in her hand, spitting curses at the men who shot her. And still, her name lived on, scrawled in chalk on saloon doors, sung in ballads by drifters with whiskey-thick voices. But for every outlaw, there was a lawman who bore the weight of order on his shoulders. One such was Sheriff Nathaniel Briggs of Dry Creek, a town barely more than a cluster of cabins and a single dusty street. Briggs had once been a soldier, scarred from the Civil War, and he carried himself with the same discipline. He spoke little, kept his badge polished, and walked the street each dawn as if on parade. His gun was not his pride. His presence was. When a gang of cattle thieves rode into Dry Creek, Briggs did not call for a posse. He stood in the street alone, facing 6 men with rifles. The townsfolk watched from behind shutters, holding their breath. "Leave the cattle, leave the town, and leave your guns," Briggs said, his voice steady as stone. Outlawry was not always born of cruelty. Sometimes it was born of desperation. The tale of the Callahan brothers was told from Texas to Kansas. They were farmers once, working dry soil that yielded little. When drought ruined their crops, they turned to robbing travelers. At first, they stole food, then money, then gold. Each robbery pulled them further from the men they had been. Yet they never shed blood unless forced, and they shared their loot with poor neighbors, who in turn sheltered them from the law. When at last they were cornered by marshals near the Red River, they refused to surrender. The younger brother, Thomas, was shot and fell. The elder, James, knelt beside him, holding his hand until the guns cut him down too. Balladeers sang their story for years. To some, they were villains. To others, victims of a land harsh to forgive weakness. But either way, their shadows stretched long. Time blurred the line between crime and myth. Newspapers painted bandits as devils or heroes, depending on who bought the ink. Children played games of sheriff and outlaw, pretending to rob stagecoaches with sticks for pistols. The shadows of outlaws frightened settlers. Yes, but they also fascinated them. Perhaps because in a world bound by dust, toil, and loss, the outlaw seemed free to ride, to take, to live outside the rules. Dangerous, yes, but also untamed, like the land itself. And so the West became not just a place of farms and railroads, but of shadows, of figures who lived fast and died young. Their names echoing in saloons and campfires long after their bones lay beneath lonely crosses on wind-blown hills. The West was often pictured as a man's world. Cowboys with wide hats, outlaws with quick guns, sheriffs with iron stares. But behind every dusty street and lonely cabin, there were women. They carried burdens heavier than rifles, built lives with fewer choices, and carved dignity out of hardship. If the West was muscle and grit, women were its backbone. They came in many forms. Pioneer wives who hauled water and bore children in sod houses. Widows who ran boarding houses to feed strangers. Teachers who crossed plains to bring letters to children. And saloon keepers who dealt cards and poured whiskey to men twice their size. Their stories were rarely sung in ballads, but without them, the frontier would have collapsed under its own weight. Rebecca Lane's story was whispered across Kansas. She was left alone when her husband vanished during a cattle drive, never to return. Some said he was killed by Comanches, others that he found another woman and fled. Whatever the truth, Rebecca had the small children and a farm clinging to dry soil. Each morning before dawn, she carried water from the creek, chopped wood, and set traps for rabbits. She learned to mend fences, plow fields, and drive oxen. At night, with a rifle across her knees, she told her children stories so they would not hear the coyotes howling outside. One winter, when blizzards buried the land, neighbors found Rebecca digging through frozen earth with her bare hands to uncover potatoes. She had hidden months before. Her children survived the winter because of her stubbornness. When asked later how she managed, she only said, "The land doesn't wait for pity." Her farm stood long after stronger men had failed, and her children grew to tell her tale, that of a woman who refused to bend. When the West itself tried to break her in the mining town of Silver Creek, there was a woman named Delilah Price who owned the Red Lantern Saloon. She was not young, not soft-spoken, and not easily fooled. Men came into her saloon expecting whiskey and women. They left with empty wallets and, often, bruised pride. Delilah had been a preacher's daughter once in Virginia, but when her husband died in a mining accident, she used the payout to buy a saloon. She wore bright dresses, carried a derringer in her garter, and kept a ledger sharper than any knife. When drunken miners grew violent, she cracked them across the skull with a whiskey bottle. When gamblers tried to cheat, she spotted their tricks faster than the sheriff. She paid her girls fairly, protected them when men forgot their manners, and was known to throw out even the richest customer if he crossed her line. Stories spread that Delilah once faced down a gang of outlaws who rode into town demanding free drink. She stood on her bar, pistol in hand, and told them, "You'll pay or you'll bleed." They laughed until she shot the hat off their leader. The gang left, muttering, and never returned. Delilah died rich by frontier standards, with a business that survived long after the gold dried up. On her gravestone, her girls carved, "She gave us a place when the world gave us none." Not all women fought with guns or whiskey bottles. Some fought with chalk and patience. Margaret Hill was 22 when she rode west from Illinois to teach in a sod schoolhouse near the Platte River. The building was nothing but packed earth and a roof of sod, its windows patched with oiled paper. Her students ranged from 6-year-olds who had never held a book to 17-year-olds who could barely spell their names. She taught in every weather, in heat so fierce that flies swarmed the children, in winters so bitter that ink froze in bottles. She wrote lessons on scraps of wood when paper ran out, used charcoal when ink was gone, and sang hymns to keep spirits alive. Once, when a blizzard trapped half the children at school, Margaret kept them for 2 nights, rationing the bread she had brought for herself, wrapping them in quilts, and telling stories until the storm passed. Parents wept when they found their children alive. Margaret never married. She said her students were her family. When she died years later of consumption, her former pupils pulled their money to place a stone at her grave. She gave us words. We give her memory for every story told. There were thousands untold. Women who birthed children on wagon trains, who buried infants in shallow graves by the roadside, who milked cows before dawn and washed clothes in icy rivers, who cooked meals over smoky fires and mended boots until their fingers bled. Their names are not always in the history books, yet without them, the West would not have survived a single season. The backbone of the frontier was not only the rifle or the horse, but the steady, unyielding strength of women who endured. The children of the West lived in a world that was both playground and battlefield. Their cradles rocked in wagons, their lullabies were the howl of coyotes, and their toys were carved from scraps of bone and wood. Childhood, as the East knew it, scarcely existed on the frontier. Here, children were not sheltered from hardship. They were participants in it from the moment they could walk. They woke before dawn to milk cows, gather eggs, fetch water, or herd goats. A boy of 6 might already carry a small axe to split kindling. A girl of 8 might cradle her younger sibling while her mother worked the fields. Childhood was short, and labor grew into them like bones beneath skin. But children also brought light into a life that might otherwise have been unbearable. Their laughter broke the silence of long winters. Their games softened the hardness of daily survival, and their imagination turned barren prairies into kingdoms of adventure. In Nebraska, there was a boy named Samuel, the youngest of 5. His father was a rancher, his mother a quiet woman who wore her strength like armor. Samuel was small for his age, often sickly, but stubborn in spirit. He longed to ride like his older brothers. They mocked him for his thin arms and wheezing lungs. But one autumn, when a calf wandered from the herd, Samuel followed its trail alone. The prairie grass was taller than he was, the sky wide and endless. By the time he found the calf, night was falling. Wolves howled as she grew older, Sarah kept the doll even when she married and moved away. Her children later found it in a chest, worn and faded. "This was my treasure," she told them, because it carried hope when nothing else could. Despite hardship, frontier children invented games with whatever they had. They raced each other barefoot across fields, played tag between wagons, and drew pictures in the dust with sticks. One boy in Kansas made a fiddle from horsehair and a bent piece of wood. It produced more squeaks than notes, but he played it proudly, and other children danced in circles, their laughter rising into the wide sky. Sometimes, when chores were done, groups of children pretended to be cowboys and outlaws. They staged mock gunfights with sticks for pistols, shouting, "Bang, you're dead," before collapsing in exaggerated deaths. For them, the West was not yet a burden. It was a stage of endless make-believe. But dangers lurked everywhere. Wells were deep, rivers swift, rattlesnakes coiled beneath porches. A fever could take a child in days, a fall from a horse in seconds. Parents often buried small graves beside cabins, marked only with wooden crosses. In one sod house settlement, a girl named Hannah drowned when spring floods swept through. Her brother, years later, carved her name into the wood of the family barn so it would never fade. Such losses were common, yet each was a wound that shaped families for generations. Children lived with danger as naturally as with wind or dust. Fear became part of growing up, and resilience became their inheritance. One of the strangest stories was of an orphan boy known only as Dusty. No one knew his true name. He appeared in towns across Kansas and Nebraska, barefoot, carrying a sack of apples he traded for food. Some said his parents had died of cholera, others that they abandoned him during a wagon train. Dusty survived by charm and wit. He sang songs for bread, carried water for coins, and told tall tales about the people he met on the road. Children followed him, enchanted, while adults shook their heads but still gave him scraps. One winter, Dusty vanished. Some said he froze in a storm. Others swore he became a drifter, a man of the road. But in every town, children remembered the orphan who carried laughter in his pockets. His memory became a legend, proof that even in hardship, a child could embody freedom. If men dreamed of land and women held homes together, children were the promise of tomorrow. Their games, their laughter, their survival ensured that the frontier was not just a place of death, but of rebirth. The West hardened them early, but it also gave them strength. These children grew into cowboys, ranchers, teachers, mothers, sheriffs, and preachers. They carried forward the lessons of resilience learned in cabins and prairies, turning struggle into identity. And though many of their names are forgotten, the echoes of their childhood remain in stories told at firesides, in faded photographs, in diaries preserved in attics. They remind us that even in a land of dust and guns, the laughter of children was the purest sound of the frontier. The West was not an empty land waiting for settlers. Long before wagons rolled across the prairies, before rifles cracked in the canyons, the land was alive with peoples whose ancestors had walked it for centuries. The Lakota hunted bison on the northern plains. The Apache and Navajo rode across deserts and mountains. The Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, and countless others lived in rhythms older than fences and railroads. When settlers came, they called it wilderness. But for the tribes, it was home, marked by sacred stones, hunting trails, and songs sung around fires. To them, the prairie was not empty, but alive with memory, and every hill had a story. The meeting of these two worlds was not gentle. It was collision, of steel with skin, of hunger with tradition, of rifles with bows. There is an old tale of a Lakota boy named Wakasa. He was 12 when he first rode with the hunters, chasing the dark waves of bison that thundered across the plains. The ground shook beneath the herds. Dust rose into the sky, and arrows flew. Wakasa's heart raced as he released his first shaft, striking a cow. That evening, he sat by the fire, listening to the elders tell stories of how the bison had been given to their people by the Great Spirit. But within his lifetime, those herds dwindled. White hunters, with rifles and greed, slaughtered bison by the thousands, leaving carcasses to rot. Trains carried hides eastward. Tongues and meat were wasted. Wakasa grew into a man watching the lifeblood of his people vanish bone by bone. One winter, when food ran short, his mother boiled leather to feed the family. He remembered the rich feasts of his boyhood and wept. Years later, when asked about his childhood, he said, "I saw the sky dark with bison. I saw it clear again, and it broke my heart." Other tribes were not simply crowded. They were driven. The Cherokee had walked their trail of tears decades earlier, forced from their lands to make way for white settlers. The same fate touched many Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and in the far west, smaller nations vanished entirely. Their names remembered only in maps and graves. One Kiowa woman, a hive, carried her baby through a forced march in winter. Snow froze her dress stiff, and the cries of children pierced the night. Soldiers pushed them onward with bayonets, and many fell where they walked. A hive's child did not survive, and she buried him beneath a tree marked only with a stone. When she reached the reservation, she carried no belongings, only grief. Her story was told for years by her descendants, not to stir hatred, but to remind them of what endurance meant. She walked for us, they said, so that we would remember. Some tribes resisted with steel and fire. The Comanche rode like lightning, their horses swift as the wind, their arrows striking before rifles could reload. They were feared by settlers and soldiers alike, yet rifles and cannons won battles that courage alone could not. Others chose diplomacy, sending chiefs to Washington, signing treaties written in languages not their own. But treaties were broken as quickly as they were made. Land promised forever was taken within a decade. Chief Spotted Elk of the Lakota once told a white negotiator, "You say this land will be ours as long as grass grows. I see the grass still grows. Why then is my land gone?" His words echoed across the plains, bitter as smoke. The clash of cultures weighed heaviest on children. Some were sent to boarding schools far from their homes, their braids cut, their languages forbidden. Teachers told them their traditions were savage, their gods false. Many returned years later, unable to speak to their grandparents, caught between worlds, strangers to both, but others carried fragments of memory. A boy named Chaska, sent to a mission school, secretly carved symbols of his people into his desk. When punished, he whispered prayers in Lakota under his breath. Later, as an old man, he told his grandchildren, "They tried to erase me, but my heart remembered." There is a story of a Cheyenne camp, surrounded by soldiers one cold night. Fires burned low, children clung to mothers, and warriors stood helpless, outnumbered and outgunned. Shots rang out, and screams rose into the sky. One survivor, a girl named Noya, later told how she hid beneath a buffalo robe, but side by side with scripture lived superstition. Settlers carried rabbits' feet, carved protective marks above their doors, and whispered of witches who walked at night. Fear was never far, for when storms swept the plains or fevers claimed children, people asked not only why, but who brought this curse. Faith gave them strength, superstition gave them explanations, and between the two, frontier life found a rhythm of both hope and dread. There was a man known as Preacher Elias. He wandered from camp to camp, Bible in hand, voice like thunder. His sermons were not confined to pulpits. He shouted the gospel atop wagons, in barns, and on street corners where saloons roared with laughter. Some loved him, swearing his words healed their despair. Others mocked him, saying he drank more whiskey than the men he condemned. But even the skeptics admitted, when Elias raised his arms to the heavens and called for rain, clouds seemed to gather not once. During a drought in Kansas, Elias walked barefoot through dust, crying, "Repent, and the Lord shall open the skies." That very night, thunder rolled and rain poured down, drenching parched soil. Farmers spoke of miracle, others called it chance. But for years, his legend lingered, and mothers told their children, when Elias prayed, heaven answered. Faith alone did not explain all. In a small settlement in Texas, a woman named Martha was shunned because of a birthmark on her face. Neighbors whispered that it was the devil's hand, that her misfortunes brought sickness to their cattle. One winter, when disease swept through the settlement, Martha's own son died. Grief turned to rage among neighbors, who accused her of witchcraft. They spoke of strange lights near her cabin, of herbs hanging from her rafters. But when a second wave of illness struck and spared only Martha's household, rumors twisted again. Some claimed she bargained with dark powers. Others believed her knowledge of herbs had saved her. Years later, old women whispered her name over cradles, sometimes as warning, sometimes as prayer. Martha lived the rest of her life on the edge of the settlement, neither fully condemned nor embraced. Her story was told in hushed voices long after, proof of how fear and superstition stalked the frontier as surely as wolves. Not all faith was born of fear. Some was born of endurance. In Colorado, when a smallpox outbreak struck a mining town, families fled into the hills, abandoning homes. One woman, Anna Richter, stayed behind. She was a German immigrant, plain and quiet, who believed God had placed her there for a reason. Anna nursed the sick, washed their bodies, and prayed at their bedsides even as her neighbors accused her of madness. "If death is to come," she said, "then let no one face it alone." She buried more than 40 souls with her own hands, yet she never fell ill. Survivors called her an angel, though she insisted she was only a servant. The town later built a chapel in her name, and miners carved her story into stone above the altar. She feared nothing but God. For all the sermons preached and hymns sung, people still looked to dreams and omens. If a hawk circled low, it meant death would soon visit. If the wind howled through a chimney, it was a spirit seeking entry. Children were told to spit 3 times when passing a graveyard to keep ghosts at bay. One rancher swore he saw a pale rider galloping across the horizon the night before his herd was struck by lightning. A miner in Nevada claimed he dreamed of tunnels collapsing, and the very next week, half his crew was buried alive. Whether true or not, such stories spread faster than wildfire. They shaped behavior as much as sermons, for fear had its own liturgy, and superstition was a kind of folk religion born of dust and desperation. Thus the frontier balanced itself, Bibles and charms, prayers and omens, angels and witches. Men carried rifles by day and whispered psalms by night. Women blessed their children's foreheads before bed, then hung horseshoes over doorways to ward off evil. Faith did not erase fear, nor did superstition destroy belief. Instead, they lived side by side, woven into the fabric of life like warp and weft of cloth. Together they gave people meaning, courage, and explanations for what could not be explained. And so the West was not only built on guns and gold, but also on prayers muttered in storms, charms hidden in pockets, and the invisible line between salvation and damnation. The frontier was a place where law traveled slower than bullets. Towns rose overnight, saloons first, then gambling halls, and only much later, if at all, a sheriff's office. Justice was a fragile thing, carried not in books of statutes, but in the holsters of men and in the tempers of crowds dotted to some. The West was freedom, no kings, no landlords, no masters. But freedom without law is peril. When disputes over land, cattle, or gold broke out, they were often settled by gunsmoke rather than gavel. And so the West became a theater where justice wore many masks: the badge, the rope, the pistol, and sometimes nothing at all. In a town called Dry Gulch, Sheriff Thomas Avery wore his badge like armor. He was not a large man, thin, weary, with eyes sharp as nails, but he carried authority in every step. The townsfolk respected him because he never took bribes, though many tried to sway him with gold dust or cattle shares. Once, a gang known as the Red Knives rode into town. They swaggered through the saloon, smashing bottles, terrorizing merchants, and daring the sheriff to stop them. Avery walked in alone. He did not draw his gun, not at first. He only spoke, "Men, you've mistaken this town for one without law. You've mistaken me for a man who bows." They laughed. The leader spat whiskey onto the floor. But when Avery finally drew, his hand was faster than theirs. Two fell dead, one wounded, the rest fled. The townsfolk buried the dead with little ceremony. Avery said only, "Law is not kindness. It is a wall. If we let it fall, we all drown." His words were carved later into the courthouse door when Dry Gulch grew into a proper town. But justice was not always carried by the sheriff. Sometimes it belonged to the crowd. In Oklahoma, a ranch hand named Elias Moore was accused of stealing a horse. He swore the horse was his, traded fair from a drifter. But the owner, a wealthy cattleman, cried theft. The sheriff hesitated, knowing the cattleman's influence. Before dawn, a mob dragged Elias from his cell. They strung him up from a cottonwood tree while his wife screamed. Some in the crowd cheered, others watched silently, guilt burning behind their eyes. Years later, the truth came out. The horse had indeed been traded, the papers mislaid. Elias had been innocent. His widow carried bitterness to her grave, and the townsfolk whispered his name as a shadow over their conscience died in the West. Justice could be as swift as a rope and as blind. Not all disputes ended in mobs. Some were fought in the open. Man against man died in Arizona. Two men, Caleb Foster, a rancher, and Nathan Pike, a gambler, quarreled over a woman named Lucy Hale. Words turned to blows, blows to threats, and soon the town whispered of a duel done at noon. Under the blazing sun, the men faced each other in the street. Lucy stood at the window of the saloon, tears streaming. The sheriff tried to stop them, but neither would yield. The crowd gathered, tense, as hands hovered over pistols. When the guns fired, Caleb fell. Nathan stood pale, smoke curling from his barrel. He dropped his pistol, shaking, and fled town the next morning. Lucy left soon after, never marrying. The street where Caleb fell was called Dead Man's Crossing for years. Children whispered that his ghost lingered there, waiting for the gambler who never returned. The West was not ruled only by men with guns. There was a woman named Belle Harrow, the outlaw queen. She dressed in men's coats, rode like the wind, and led a gang that robbed stagecoaches and trains. Unlike many outlaws, she rarely killed. She preferred cunning to bloodshed. Once, when cornered by marshals in a canyon, she lit a fire and sent her horses stampeding with lanterns tied to their saddles. The marshals chased the decoys while Belle escaped into the night. But her legend ended not with capture, but betrayal. A man she loved turned her in for gold. She stood trial in Denver, calm as stone, and when sentenced, she said, "You cannot jail the wind. You cannot chain the prairie." She served years in prison, her health failing. Yet long after her death, children played games shouting, "I'm Belle Harrow." Her ghost, it was said, still rode under moonlit skies. In mining camps, just as often belonged to whoever had the most gold dust. A prospector named Miguel Alvarado struck a rich vein in Nevada. Overnight, men who had ignored him sought his friendship. But greed breeds envy. One night, Miguel was ambushed, beaten, and left for dead. His claim was stolen, his gold carted away. Miguel survived, scarred and limping. He spent years fighting in courts, but the judges were bought. In the end, he died penniless, muttering, "Gold is worth more than blood in this land." His tale spread among miners as a warning: strike fortune, and you strike danger too. For every sheriff like Avery, there were 10 towns with outlaw. For every preacher like Elias, there were mobs with ropes. For every Belle Harrow, there were nameless bandits who died in the dust. Justice in the frontier was never certain. It was written in blood, erased by greed, and rewritten by whoever had the faster hand or the louder crowd. And yet, for all its failures, people still long for justice. They built jails, hired sheriffs, raised courthouses, for they knew that without some law, even fragile, the frontier would devour them all. The West was not only guns and gold, it was also the endless struggle to build order in a land that resisted it. If men of the frontier carried guns and drove cattle, women carried the hidden weight of survival. They stitched the seams of society with needle and song, with endurance and silent strength. While sheriffs wore badges and outlaws wore pistols, women wore resilience, an invisible armor that kept families alive when bullets, hunger, and loneliness threatened to tear them apart. The West was no place for delicate lives. Women rose with the sun, baked bread before dawn, hauled water from wells, and birthed children on dirt floors. They taught, healed, and, when necessary, fought. They buried their dead and sang lullabies over graves too small. And yet, in their stories, One hears not only sorrow but fierce defiance, proof that they were not shadows behind men, but forces equal to storms and fires. Her name was Eleanor Price, and she arrived in Silver Creek with little more than a trunk of books, and a determination stronger than iron. She was 23, with hair tied neatly, a plain dress, and eyes that measured people not by wealth or gun, but by honesty. The town had built a one-room schoolhouse, but most doubted it would last. Children were needed in fields, not at desks. Yet Eleanor rang the bell each morning, refusing to yield. Her students came barefoot, some hungry, some barely speaking English. She taught them letters, numbers, and the stories of faraway worlds. More than that, she taught them hope, that life could stretch beyond cattle fences and dust. When outlaws once tried to use the schoolhouse as their refuge, Eleanor stood in the doorway with a shotgun. "This is for children," she said. "You'll find no shelter here." They laughed, but the steadiness of her hand made them turn away. Years later, when those children grew into ranchers and shopkeepers, they still spoke of Miss Price. "She gave us more than knowledge," one said. "She gave us a horizon." Not every woman came to the West by choice. Some came by following husbands who never returned. In Wyoming, Margaret Callahan buried her husband after a cattle stampede. She was left with 3 children and no land title in her name. Neighbors told her to remarry or leave. Instead, she plowed the earth herself, yoked oxen with her own hands, and endured winters that killed men twice her size. At night, she read the Bible aloud, her voice steady even as tears streaked her cheeks. Her children grew up remembering not her sorrow but her fire. "Our mother was a wall," her son later wrote, "against hunger, against cold, against despair. She never let it break through." Margaret never remarried. She raised her children into strength and lived to see her land become fertile, her cabin grow into a house. The valley bore her name long after she was gone, Callahan's Ridge. If schoolhouses were places of hope, saloons were places of survival, and many of them were ruled by women as fierce as any gunslinger. Clara Beaumont owned the Golden Star Saloon in Dodge City. She was no one's fool, quick with a smile, quicker with a pistol under the bar. Men came for whiskey, cards, and music, but they learned quickly that Clara's word was law. One night, 2 cowboys drew knives over a card game. Before the sheriff could arrive, Clara fired a shot into the ceiling. Sawdust rained down, silence froze the room. "Gentlemen," she said, "you're in my house. You bleed outside." She paid her girls fair wages, fed drifters, and made her saloon a place both feared and respected. Though preachers condemned her, townsfolk knew that without Clara, half the men would have killed each other before dawn. When she died, the saloon closed for a week. The town mourned as though it had lost a mayor. For in truth, Clara Beaumont had ruled Dodge more firmly than any badge. Perhaps the rarest role for women on the frontier was that of physician. But Dr. Josephine Mercer became a legend in Colorado. She rode on horseback across mountains, carrying saddlebags filled with herbs, scalpels, and morphine. She treated miners crushed by rock, women in childbirth, children burning with fever. Once, during a blizzard, she rode 12 miles to deliver a baby. The cabin was dark, the mother weak, the wind howling through cracks in the wall. By lantern light, Josephine worked until dawn. When the baby's cry filled the room, she wept as though it were her own. Not all welcomed her. Some men sneered, saying medicine was no place for women. But when their wives and daughters needed saving, they called for Josephine. She answered, no matter the hour, no matter the road. When she died at 70, hundreds gathered, from miners to ranchers, to honor the woman who had been both healer and warrior. They said her spirit still rode the mountain trails, a lantern flickering in the snow. Not all women left names in history. Many lived and died in silence, remembered only in family Bibles or letters hidden in trunks. They cooked meals no one praised, mended clothes that wore out again, bore children who did not always live to grow. One diary found in a sod house told of a woman known only as Mary. She wrote of loneliness so deep she spoke to the wind, of singing lullabies to herself, of waiting months for letters that never came. Yet she ended each entry with the same line, "I will endure." It is for these women, nameless and voiceless, that the story of the West is incomplete without them. They bore the weight of history quietly, but without their labor, there would have been no towns, no farms, no generations to follow. From Eleanor the teacher to Margaret the widow, from Clara the saloon keeper to Josephine the doctor, the women of the West were more than companions. They were creators, guardians, rulers, and healers. Their courage was less sung, their names less recorded, but their power was no less mighty. For every gunfight that echoed in history books, there were hundreds of lullabies sung into the night, loaves of bread baked, wounds bound, seeds planted, and tears shed. The West was not only built by the iron of men, but also by the endurance of women. Without them, the frontier would have crumbled into dust. When the iron horse thundered across the plains, it was more than a machine. It was a promise, a terror, and a revolution. Before its steel wheels, journeys took months. With them, the land shrank and the world tilted. Towns rose where stations were built. Others withered if the tracks passed them by. The whistle of the train became the heartbeat of the West, steady, relentless, echoing across valleys and deserts. Yet for every triumph of steel, there was sweat, blood, and bone. The railroad was not simply laid across the land. It was fought for, carved, and paid for by men who bled into the dust. Railroad barons in polished coats spoke of destiny. They sat in grand offices in Boston or New York, drawing lines across maps as if the land were paper. To them, the prairie was empty space waiting for iron. They called it progress, civilization, manifest destiny. But out on the ground, progress was nodding. It was blasting powder in mountains, shovels in rock, and endless tides hammered into soil. It was hunger in the bellies of workers, frostbite in winter passes, and cholera in the camps. Among those workers was Li Wei, a Chinese laborer who left Guangdong with nothing but a wooden flute and the hope of sending money home. He joined thousands of his countrymen who dug tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, their hands raw, their lungs blackened with dust. They were paid less than white workers, given the most dangerous tasks, and yet they worked with silent precision. When avalanches buried camps, when dynamite failed and tunnels collapsed, Li Wei carried stones until his fingers bled dotted night. He played his flute, soft notes drifting through the camp. Other workers, Irish and Chinese alike, gathered to listen. For a few moments, the railroad was not sweat and death, but music and memory. One winter, an avalanche swept away his closest friend. Li Wei dug for hours, but found only shattered tools. He wept, then returned to work the next day. Years later, when the tracks were finished, he touched the iron rails with trembling hands and whispered, "This is bone. This is blood." Beside the Chinese labored the Irish strong men who fled famine only to find another kind of hunger. They sang as they worked, rough voices rising over hammer strikes. Whiskey in the jar, Molly Malone, songs of old Ireland that mixed with the clang of iron. One Irishman, Patrick O'Donnell, told his children, "I broke rocks until my back bent, but each stone I shattered was a step toward a land that might one day be ours." He lived long enough to see his sons ride the train west, sitting where once he had crawled, exhausted, laying track. The railroad was not only iron, it was inheritance. The railroad birthed towns like mushrooms after rain. They called them hell on wheels camps, saloons, gambling dens, brothels, all rising in tents beside the tracks. Workers spent their wages on whiskey, cards, and women, then vanished when the tracks moved on. Some towns survived, growing into cities. Others disappeared, their streets swallowed by grass, their names forgotten. Only rusted nails and soil marked where laughter and gunfire once filled the night. But progress carried a shadow. The railroad cut through the great migration routes of bison. Hunters rode the trains, shooting herds for sport, leaving carcasses rotting in the sun. Mountains of skulls rose by the tracks, bleaching white in the plains. For native tribes, this was more than loss of food. It was the end of a world. One Lakota elder said, "When the buffalo are gone, our hearts will die." And so it was. Not all battles were fought with dynamite. Some were fought in courts and fields dot in Nebraska. A farmer named John Keating watched as the railroad cut across his land. He was offered payment, but too little. He refused. The company built anyway, carving through his fields, leaving his crops trampled. John sued. But the judges sided with the railroad. His farm crumbled. His children scattered. Years later, he stood at a station, watching a train roar past. He spat into the dust and muttered, "Iron has more rights than flesh." His story was told again and again by farmers who felt crushed between rails and progress. And yet, for all the pain, the completion of the railroad was seen as triumph. When the Union Pacific and Central Pacific met at Promontory Summit in 1869, a golden spike was driven into the rails. Speeches were made, telegraphs sent, champagne poured. But for the workers, Chinese, Irish, Mexican, freed slaves, there were no golden rewards. They stood in the background, their names unrecorded, their hands scarred. The West was connected, but at the cost of their silence still. When trains roared westward, families rode them to new homes. Letters flew across the land in days instead of months. The whistle of the iron horse became a hymn of progress, even as it drowned the songs of the old world. For Leeway, for Patrick, for John, for countless nameless men, the railroad was not just steel. It was sacrifice etched into the earth. Each rail carried not only trains, but stories of avalanches and songs, of whiskey and prayers, of loss and hope. And when the whistle echoed through canyons, it was not only the sound of progress, it was the ghostly chorus of all who had labored, suffered, and dreamed beneath its wheels. The iron horse rode on. But the land remembered dot by the late years of the 19th century. The frontier began to wither, though not all at once. Some towns flourished into cities with railroads, schools, and brick courthouses. But others, once bright with noise and promise, slowly fell silent. These were the last frontier towns, places born of dust and gold, of whiskey and prayer, and destined to return to silence when the reasons for their birth ran dry. The streets of such towns carried echoes, the shuffle of boots, the laughter of gamblers, the hymns of Sunday choirs. But as years passed, only the wind kept them company. Take the story of Dawson's Ridge, a mining settlement in Colorado. At its peak, Dawson's Ridge rang with the sound of picks and shovels. And by night, the saloon windows spilled lamplight onto streets thick with music and laughter. Men gambled their wages, women danced in red skirts, and the promise of gold made even the poorest dream of riches. But the veins thinned, the gold ran out. Families left with wagons loaded, saloons closed one by one. The death of towns did not mean the death of memory. Ghost towns became shrines of what the West had been. Shrines not of saints, but of gamblers, teachers, ranchers, and children. Travelers rode of lanterns glowing in windows long abandoned, of voices carried on the wind, of laughter that seemed to rise from saloons buried in sand. Some swore the spirits of miners still swung picks beneath the mountains, or that women in red dresses walked moonlit streets, searching for partners who never came. And yet, for all the ghost stories, these places held a beauty beyond their decay. To walk their streets was to feel time itself whisper. Every creak of a door, every shattered bottle, every weathered sign told a tale of courage, greed, hope, and ruin. The last frontier towns remind us that the West was not only built, but also abandoned. That progress was both creation and destruction. Railroads gave life and stole it. Gold made kings and beggars in the same breath. And every settlement was a gamble with fate. For each city that thrived, a dozen withered back into earth. leaving behind nothing but ruins and memory. The West did not end with a bang of guns nor the last whistle of trains, but with silence, the silence of Dawson's Ridge, of Silver Hollow, of Redwater, of countless nameless towns whose graves are marked only by wind and stone. And in that silence, the story of the frontier lingers, waiting for voices to rise again. If only in memory, the Wild West did not die only in silence. It lived on in the stories people told long after towns had fallen and rails had rusted. Around campfires, in dim saloons, on porches of weathered houses, the past became legend, and legends became truth for those who had nothing else to cling to. The West was not only built of wood and iron, but of memory, of words carried by the wind, and of tales whispered from father to son, from grandmother to child. There were stories of lawmen whose pistols never missed, of outlaws who rode like shadows and vanished before dawn. There were stories of women who stood with rifles at their doors, defending children against wolves or bandits. And there were stories of towns that refused to die, where music played though no one was left alive. Every tale was polished by retelling, until what had once been a scrap of truth gleamed like pure gold in the firelight. Children sat wide-eyed while old men spoke of gunfights at high noon, where the figures faced each other on dust-choked streets, silence broken only by the rattle of spurs. They told how the fastest draw was not always the one who lived, for courage or cunning could bend fate in a heartbeat. One tale told of a drifter named Sam Carver, who carried a pistol worn smooth by use. They said he faced 20 men in Red Gulch and walked away untouched. Others claimed he was shot in the back by a coward and buried in an unmarked grave. No one knew the truth, but every boy in every town dreamed of having his courage, and every mother warned her sons not to follow his path. Some legends were gentler, woven from kindness rather than gunpowder. Old-timers spoke of Clara Bell, a teacher in a frontier town who taught not only letters but hope. They said she refused to leave when cholera swept through, that she nursed children until her own body failed. The town buried her with hymnals, and travelers swore they could hear a woman's voice singing on quiet nights, drifting through the empty schoolhouse. For generations, her name was whispered as a blessing, a reminder that the West was not only forged by violence, but also by compassion. And then there were the darker stories, the ones told in hushed voices when the fire burned low. Men spoke of ghost riders who galloped across the plains under moonlight, their horses hooves silent on the earth, their eyes burning like embers. They said these riders were outlaws who had cheated justice, cursed to ride forever with no rest. Travelers claimed they saw them on stormy nights, watching from ridges, never approaching but never vanishing either. Some said the ghost riders were a warning that greed and cruelty left scars not only on the land, but on the soul. The myths of the West often blurred with truth. A farmer might tell of the day a stranger came to his homestead and shared bread, only later learning that man had been Jesse James himself, hiding from the law. A widow might speak of a rider who stopped to fix her broken fence, vanishing before she could thank him. And neighbors would swear it was Wild Bill Hickok returned from the grave. Names stretched, details twisted. But what mattered was not accuracy. It was the belief that the West still breathed in every wind, every shadow, every lonely road, even as railroads spread and cities rose. Even as telegraphs clicked and modern life marched forward, the legends refused to fade. A cowboy riding through the desert swore he heard voices singing old trail songs. Though he rode alone, a miner claimed he saw lanterns flickering deep in abandoned shafts carried by men long dead. And in the silence of ghost towns, some travelers swore that laughter still drifted from saloons, glasses clinking in a toast to a world that was no more. What gave these stories their power was not only mystery but longing. People wanted to believe the frontier spirit had not vanished, that the courage, sacrifice, and struggle that built the West still lingered. The legends became a way of keeping the past alive, of stitching memory into the fabric of the present. And so, around fires and in quiet homes, people spoke of heroes and villains, saints and sinners, ghosts and angels. They spoke not to record history but to feel it, to remind themselves that the land beneath their feet was soaked not only with sweat and blood, but with stories. The West became not just a place, but a dream of danger and hope, of cruelty and kindness, of silence and song. In the dream, time bent. Dawson's Ridge still rang with pickaxes. Silver Hollow's Opera House still glowed with chandeliers. Redwater's church bell still tolled across the prairie. Clara Bell still sang to children. Sam Carver still faced 20 men. Ghost Riders still thundered under the moon. And though the towns were empty, though the graves were weathered, though the iron horse roared over steel instead of dust, the West lived on, not in maps or monuments, but in memory. The legends of the frontier remind us that no world truly dies if it is remembered. As long as voices whisper of outlaws and angels, as long as children lean forward to hear, the Wild West still rides, not in flesh, not in gunfire, but in stories. And perhaps that is the greatest truth of all, that what we remember shapes what never fades. The story of the West is often told with 6-shooters, cattle herds, and men in dusters who carved their names into the land with pistols and plows. Yet behind them, beside them, and often ahead of them stood women whose names rarely reach the pages of history, but without whom the frontier could never have survived. They did not ride into town at high noon for gunfights, but they fought their own battles against loneliness, hunger, death in childbirth, drought, poverty, and despair. If the West was a crucible that tested the human spirit, then the women of the frontier were its fiercest survivors. Imagine the endless plains stretching under the burning sun. A cabin built of rough logs with smoke rising weakly from its chimney. Inside, a woman stirs a pot of beans, a baby on her hip, another child tugging at her skirts, while outside her husband digs furrows in hard soil. Such was the picture repeated thousands of times across the land. Many of these women had left comfortable homes in the East or in Europe, trading lace curtains and city markets for bare floors and wide horizons. Some came willingly, driven by the promise of new beginnings. Others were pulled by duty, following husbands or fathers, never asked if they wished. Not all women of the West lived in cabins or bore children. Some ruled saloons, pouring whiskey for rough men and keeping order with sharper tongues than any sheriff's badge. In Dodge City, they spoke of Molly O'Hara, who owned a saloon by the tracks. She had come from Ireland with nothing but a fiddle and fierce eyes. She played music that could still a brawl, and if that failed, she kept a shotgun under the counter. Men respected her because she feared none of them. They said she once threw a drunk cowboy through her own window when he raised a hand to her barmaid. Yet Molly also kept a box under her bed where she hid letters from her mother, written in neat Gaelic script, reminding her of a green land she would never see again. There were also women who followed armies or worked in camps of miners. Some sold food, others their bodies, for the frontier had little room for gentility. Among them was a woman known only as Lisa Jane, who drifted from Colorado to Montana, cooking for prospectors. She had a laugh that rolled across the camp like thunder, and men swore she brought more luck than dynamite. Yet she kept her savings hidden in a tin box and spoke often of buying a farm, where she could raise chickens and roses. No one knew if she ever did, for one day she vanished, leaving only the scent of her cooking in the ashes of the fire pit. There were school teachers too, sent west by churches or governments, to bring letters and numbers to children who had known only dust and cattle. Imagine a young woman from Ohio, barely 20, standing in front of a dozen ragged children in a one-room schoolhouse. Her dress is patched, her shoes worn, yet her voice is steady as she recites the alphabet. The wind rattles the shutters, wolves howl in the distance, but she continues. For many, she was the first taste of learning, the first glimpse of a world beyond the prairie. Some of those children would later become lawmakers, preachers, or ranch owners, carrying her lessons in their hearts long after she was forgotten. And yet, the frontier was merciless. Childbirth often killed mothers. Fever swept through cabins, leaving widowers with infants they did not know how to feed. Women learned to make do with what they had, so boiled from lye. Clothes patched until they were more patched than fabric, meals stretched from cornmeal and beans. A wedding ring might be sold for flour. A Bible became the only inheritance passed down. In diaries that survive, one reads again and again, "We endure, even in death." Women shaped the frontier. Graves on lonely hillsides often carried names like Mary, Anna, Margaret, women who crossed rivers, bore children, planted gardens, and held the fabric of life together with bare hands. Without them, the West would have been nothing but dust and graves. With them, it became a place where families could dream, where songs could be sung, where hope could take root even in the hardest soil. Their stories may not have filled newspapers or dime novels, but they filled the land itself. Every cabin built, every field planted, every hymn sung on a Sunday morning bears the invisible signature of women who refused to break. The guns of the West made noise, but it was the quiet labor of women that gave it meaning. The frontier may be remembered for its sheriffs and outlaws, for its cattle drives and its railroads, but in truth, it was also remembered in the lullabies sung to children at night, in the bread baked from the last handful of flour, in the prayers whispered over sickbeds. The women of the West stood not in the spotlight of history, but in its foundation. And without foundations, no story stands. The children of the frontier grew up in a world that was at once vast and confining, full of open skies yet bound tightly by hardship. Their playground was the prairie itself. Their toys were sticks and stones, and their lullabies were the howls of coyotes outside the cabin walls. They were born into danger and raised in scarcity, and yet they carried the future of the West in their small, calloused hands. To speak of the frontier without its children is to leave out the beating heart that kept families moving forward through hunger, through storms, through fear. From the moment they could walk, frontier children were put to work. A boy of 5 might carry water from the creek, stumbling under the weight of a bucket too large for him. A girl barely older might rock a cradle while her mother milked the cow. Childhood was short, but it was also sharp, filled with moments that carve character as surely as wind carves stone. Yet within the cracks of labor, children found joy chasing grasshoppers through tall weeds, racing barefoot across dusty roads, carving whistles from willow branches. Laughter rang out even in the poorest cabins, defying hunger, defying death. There was the story of Thomas McBride, who grew up on a ranch in Texas. At 8 years old, he could already ride bareback, driving calves into pens with a shout louder than his size suggested. His father gave him a small rope, and Thomas practiced lassoing fence posts until his wrist blistered. By 12, he rode on real cattle drives, sleeping under stars, listening to older cowboys tell stories of ghosts, bandits, and heroes. He saw rivers that nearly drowned horses, lightning storms that split the sky, and long days of dust that seemed never-ending. By the time he was grown, Thomas could not remember a life without the saddle. He once wrote in a letter, "My childhood was measured not in years but in miles of trail." In Nebraska, young Emily Carter grew up in a sod house with walls of earth. Winters howled through the cracks. Summers baked the walls until dust fell like powder on her blankets. She had a single doll, sewn from scraps of cloth, with eyes inked by her mother's hand. Emily named her Hope when locusts came one summer and ate through every stalk of corn. Emily buried her doll in the soil, whispering to the earth to bring back life. The next spring, when green shoots finally rose again, her mother found the doll still buried, its cloth stiff with dirt. Emily held it close, believing her prayers had worked. Not all childhoods were sweetened by imagination. Many ended before they had fully begun. Diseases swept through cabins like fire through dry grass, measles, cholera, influenza. Small coffins were common, and churchyards filled with names of children who never reached 10 years old. Families carried grief silently, for tears did not plow fields or feed cattle. But in diaries, one finds lines like, "He was with us for only 5 summers," or Her laugh still lingers in the air. The loss of children was as much a part of frontier life as the building of fences still. Children adapted. They learned the language of survival faster than their parents. They knew which plants could soothe a fever, how to read the sky for storms, how to listen for the cry of wolves. They learned to load rifles by the time they could hold them, for the frontier did not allow innocence to last long. A 10-year-old boy might be left in charge of the cabin while his father was away, rifle across his knees. His younger siblings huddled beside him. A 12-year-old girl might drive a wagon through storms when her mother collapsed from exhaustion. Yet alongside hardship bloomed resilience. Children invented games from nothing, making hoops of barrel rings, carving tops from corn cobs. They played tag among wagons, hide and seek in tall grasses that seemed like forests to their small frames. Older boys told younger ones ghost stories at night, scaring them with tales of bandits or phantom riders, while girls whispered secrets under quilts, dreaming of dresses they had never seen except in pictures from magazines. Sometimes their laughter reached beyond cabins and camps. In New Mexico, a missionary once wrote, "The children here are poor as earth, yet they laugh more freely than the rich men I knew back east." That laughter was defiance itself, a weapon against despair. The children of the frontier remind us that even in the harshest worlds, life insists on beginning again, small and fragile, yet unyielding. Their laughter echoes still across empty prairies, a sound more powerful than gunfire, a sound that says, "We were here, we endured, we dreamed." The frontier was a place of hunger, storms, and violence, but it was also a place where faith burned like a lantern in the dark. For settlers who lived weeks away from the nearest neighbor, where nights stretched endless and wolves circled cabins, religion was not luxury but necessity. The Bible often lay on the same shelf as a rifle. Prayers rose alongside the smoke of the hearth. Yet faith on the frontier was never pure and orderly. It mingled with superstition, with whispers of spirits in the wind, with charms of bone and feather. The West was a land of preachers and prophets, but also of fortune tellers, medicine men, and midwives who muttered incantations while mixing herbs. Families gathered for Sunday services in one-room schoolhouses or under trees. Benches made of logs, the preacher's pulpit a wooden crate. They sang hymns loud enough to drown the coyotes, voices cracking but fierce. A traveling minister might ride into town, his saddlebag filled with tracts, his voice a booming thunder that promised salvation and warned of damnation. He could stay a week, stir hearts until tears fell, then ride away, leaving the town with its sins and its hopes. Children feared him and admired him, and mothers prayed their husbands would listen. One such preacher was Reverend Elijah Strong, who walked barefoot across Kansas when his horse died. They said he carried nothing but a Bible and a jug of water. Yet he filled towns with trembling when he thundered about fire and brimstone. He baptized men in muddy rivers, shouted down gamblers in saloons, and once stood on a wagon to preach until lightning struck a tree beside him, leaving him untouched. People called it a miracle, though others whispered it was coincidence. Elijah himself said, "The Lord uses storms to make himself heard." He died on the trail, his body found with the Bible open to the Psalms, and farmers swore that when they buried him, a double rainbow stretched across the prairie. But not all faith was Christian. The West was home to many nations, each carrying their own beliefs. Lakota medicine men burned sage to cleanse camps. Navajo singers chanted prayers for healing. Apache shamans carved amulets from turquoise to protect warriors. Settlers often dismissed these as pagan, yet some turned to native healers when cholera swept through or when no doctor could be found. There are tales of a child dying of fever until a Cheyenne woman placed herbs on her chest and sang softly. The child survived, and the grateful mother swore the song lingered in the rafters for days. Faith mingled across cultures, sometimes in respect, often in tension, but always shaping the rhythm of life. Alongside prayers came superstition. A horseshoe nailed above the door, a Bible under a pillow to ward off nightmares. a lock of hair braided into a charm against sickness. Women carried sachets of dried herbs sewn into their aprons, believing they kept away evil spirits. Cowboys refused to whistle at night, fearing it would summon ghosts or rattlesnakes. Prospectors flipped coins before digging, whispering oaths to unseen forces. And when children died, mothers sometimes tied their shoes together and hung them in trees, a sign that their spirits might walk safely into heaven. There was the tale of Martha Green, a midwife who mixed prayers with charms. She carried a pouch of bones that she claimed were from a sacred deer, and she touched them to women in labor, saying they gave strength. Some mocked her as a witch, others sought her desperately. One winter, a woman gave birth after 3 days of agony, saved, it seemed, by Martha's whispered spells. Whether it was skill, herbs, or chance, the family believed, and belief itself was power. Martha died with her pouch still in her hand, and they buried it with her, though neighbors whispered that the ground trembled as the coffin was lowered. The frontier's nights were long, and darkness bred stories. Men spoke of lights dancing in the plains, ghost fires that flickered with no source. Hunters swore they heard drums in the distance when no tribe was near. Children claimed they saw women in white walking near rivers, calling in voices sweet as honey, luring them toward water. Adults hushed them, but checked their doors twice before bed. Fear and belief were siblings, and on the frontier, they shared the same roof, even in towns. Faith was mixed with doubt. A saloon might stand across from a church, bells ringing while whiskey flowed. Men gambled on Saturday and prayed on Sunday, their souls balanced between two worlds. Preachers railed against sin, yet some of them drank in secret or ran away with another man's wife. Hypocrisy did not kill faith. It made it more human. For the people of the West, heaven and hell were not abstract, but daily choices lived in cabins, saloons, and fields dotting Colorado. A miner named Henry Brooks claimed he was saved by a vision. He was trapped underground for 3 days after a collapse, darkness pressing like a tomb. He swore he saw a woman in light, guiding him toward a crack in the rocks. Crawling through, he found air and rescue. He built a small chapel beside his cabin and spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that angels walk the mines. Whether he saw truth or hallucination, his faith gave him strength, and the chapel still stands, weathered but stubborn, its bell cracked but echoing. Faith on the frontier was not uniform, but it was universal. Everyone believed in something: God, spirits, luck, or charms. Without belief, the West would have been too heavy to bear. Religion gave families courage to plant crops again after droughts, to bury children and still wake at dawn, to cross rivers and deserts with nothing but hope. Superstition gave them comfort, a sense that the unseen might still care for them when the seen world turned cruel. The frontier carved people into stone, but faith kept their hearts from breaking. When settlers sang hymns across the plains, when mothers whispered prayers into the ears of dying infants, when cowboys clutched talismans before duels, the West became not just a place of dust and blood, but of mystery and reverence. And though the churches crumble, though the charms rot, but not every place had a doctor. In most towns, it was mothers who bore the weight of medicine. They brewed teas of echinacea, sage, and peppermint, pressed poultices of onion and garlic against swollen throats, burned herbs to cleanse the air when fever spread. Some remedies worked, some did nothing, and some killed as surely as the disease. Still, women carried the knowledge like treasure, teaching it to daughters so the chain of survival would not break. Epidemics rolled across the plains like wildfires. Cholera took camps in days, leaving wagons abandoned mid-journey. Measles wiped out entire schools of children. Smallpox scarred faces and left cemeteries filled with tiny graves. Survivors remembered the smell of sickness in the air, the cries of parents, the silence that followed. In one Nebraska town, they said the church bell rang so often for funerals that the rope frayed to threads. Death did not discriminate, yet people sought to give it meaning. Funerals were small but fierce. A coffin might be built of rough boards, nailed together by grieving hands. Or sometimes no coffin at all, only a body wrapped in blankets, lowered into soil. Families gathered, a hymn was sung, prayers rose, and the earth was filled again. Some graves bore carved stones, others only wooden markers that rotted within years, leaving no sign of the lives beneath. Still, memory clung. Families visited, whispered names, left flowers or trinkets. Even in a land where survival demanded hardness, grief softened hearts. There was the story of Anna Muller, a German immigrant in Dakota Territory. She lost 4 children to diphtheria within a single winter. Neighbors found her kneeling in the snow, placing handmade wooden toys on each grave. When asked how she could go on, she answered, "Because the soil is hungry, but the living still need me." She nursed neighbors through their own sickness, never charging, until she'd have died a few years later. They buried her beside her children, and travelers passing by still find the faint outlines of toys carved in stone. Yet survival, too, had its legends. In Montana, a boy named Caleb fell from a horse and split his skull on a rock. His mother pressed cloth soaked in whiskey to the wound, while his father sat through the night, whispering stories to keep him awake. Against all odds, Caleb lived, though a scar split his brow for life. He grew into a man who told his children, "Death knocked once, but I refused to open the door." His survival became a family story, repeated for generations, proof that even on the edge of despair, life could cling. Not all stories ended in graves. Some ended in awe. A prospector in Nevada crushed by a cave-in was pulled out 3 days later, bones broken but alive, swearing he had been kept company by voices in the dark. A woman struck by lightning in Kansas was found breathing hours later, her dress scorched, her hair white from the shock. People called her the Thunder Widow, and she lived another 20 years. A wagon overturned in Missouri, crushing a child, yet he walked away unhurt. And neighbors called it the hand of God. Still, more often than not, death came quietly. A cough that worsened, a wound that festered, a woman bleeding in childbirth with no one to stop it. Families buried their dead and carried on, because they had no choice. Yet in the carrying on lay the true survival. The West was littered with graves, but also with living who refused to join them before their time. Medicine on the frontier was never certain. It was prayer mixed with herbs, steel mixed with luck, superstition mixed with knowledge. It was the trembling hands of a doctor by lantern light, the whispered song of a mother at a sick bed, the stubborn heartbeat of a man who lived when he should not have. And though science has marched on, though hospitals now gleam with light and sterile tools, the memory of those who fought with nothing but scraps and faith remains. The frontier was a place where death was certain, but life was stubborn. And in that stubbornness lay the triumph of survival, not the loud triumph of parades or banners, but the quiet triumph of one more sunrise, one more harvest, one more child's laugh in a world that tried its best to silence it. On the frontier, seasons were not merely markers on a calendar. They were tyrants and givers, killers and saviors, sculptors of the land and of the people who dwelled upon it. To live a year in the West was to endure a cycle of trials so sharp and unforgiving that each turn of the earth felt like another gamble. Spring might bring life, or it might bring floods that washed away cabins. Summer could yield harvests, or it could scorch the plains until cattle collapsed in the dust. Autumn carried the weight of preparation, a frantic race against hunger. Winter, long and merciless, tested every breath. The frontier was less a land and more a rhythm, and its beat was measured in seasons. Spring arrived not with gentle blossoms but with violence. Melting snow turned rivers into beasts, flooding valleys and sweeping wagons into frothing waters. Cabins sank to their knees in mud, and livestock drowned in fields that had been pasture months before. Yet spring was also renewal. Families stepped outside after months of smoke-stained air, their lungs filling with a sweetness forgotten. Children splashed in puddles as mothers bent to plant corn seeds into soil still cold. The thaw carried hope as well as peril. One story tells of Elias Carter, a homesteader in Nebraska. His cabin stood near a river that swelled each spring. One year, the flood rose higher than ever, tearing at his home until walls buckled. He carried his wife and 2 children to the loft, praying the waters would recede. For 2 days they huddled there, the river licking at the beams. When the flood fell back, the cabin was half gone, yet the family lived. Elias rebuilt, raising the foundation with stone, and every spring thereafter he told his children, "The river feeds and the river takes, but we must learn to stand." His words became a family creed, passed down long after the cabin itself rotted. Summer followed, heavy with promise and danger. Fields ripened under sun, but the sun was cruel, beating the earth until cracks split the soil. Grasshoppers swarmed in black clouds, stripping fields bare in hours. Wells dried, cattle staggered, and tempers burned as hot as the sky. Yet summer was also a season of labor that defined survival. Men sweated in fields, women churned butter and dried fruit. Children hauled water from distant springs. Each day was a battle to wring life from the earth. There is the tale of Clara Weston, who in the drought of 1874 saved her family not with strength but cunning. When the well ran dry, her husband despaired. Clara dug near a patch of willows, trusting the tree's thirst. She struck a trickle, muddy but real, and through careful tending she coaxed water enough to keep her family and cattle alive. Neighbors mocked her for chasing roots, but when their own fields withered, they came begging. Clara shared what she had, though little, and earned a reputation as the Willow Woman, a name spoken with respect long after her bones lay in prairie earth. Autumn was a season of urgency. Every hour was spent storing, mending, and guarding. Crops were harvested, meat salted, wood chopped until piles rose like walls beside cabins. Families knew that a missed chore in October could mean starvation in January. Nights grew longer, winds colder, and the land itself seemed to whisper, "Prepare or perish." The story of Thomas and Abigail Crow is told in Kansas. They had 6 children and only one good harvest. Abigail salted pork, dried beans, and sewed quilts until her hands bled, while Thomas felled trees from dawn until dusk. Yet when winter came, the supply still dwindled quickly. The family survived only because neighbors pulled what they had, sharing potatoes, cornmeal, and even scraps of venison. It became known as the winter of every land breeds stories, but the West, with its vast skies and silent prairies, seemed made for them. Around campfires, in saloons, or whispered in cabins during storms. Tales passed from mouth to mouth, stitched from fear, longing, and pride. They were not written in books but carved into memory, shaped by smoke and wind. Some were warnings, some were boasts, some were prayers disguised as fables. Together they formed a folklore that was as wild and enduring as the frontier itself. One of the most enduring legends was that of the ghost rider. Cowboys swore that on nights when the moon hung low and the wind screamed through the sage, a rider cloaked in shadows galloped across the plains. His horse's hooves made no sound, yet sparks flared with each step. Some said he was the spirit of a murdered outlaw, doomed to ride until he found justice. Others believe he was death itself, scouting the prairie for souls ready to be taken. Men told of seeing the rider vanish into rivers without a splash, or gallop into storms where lightning bent toward him like a crown. No one ever claimed to have spoken to him, for those who chased the ghost were said never to return. Another story belonged to the miners of Nevada, the tale of the singing mine. It was said that in the hills near Virginia City, a shaft whispered songs when the wind blew just right. Men swore they heard choirs underground, voices rising as if from a cathedral carved in stone. At first, they laughed and called it echoes. But one by one, men who worked the singing mine disappeared. Their lamps were found extinguished, their tools abandoned, their names scratched into walls as if in farewell. The mine was sealed, yet travelers still report hearing faint hymns on quiet nights. And locals warn, do not follow the music or you will join the choir. Not all legends were born of fear. Some were made of pride, of human triumph stretched into myth. There was the story of Big Jack Hamlin, a giant of a man who was said to lift oxen clear off the ground. He was a blacksmith in Texas, and children grew up hearing how he bent horseshoes with his bare hands, how he once wrestled a grizzly and won. Truth was likely smaller. Perhaps he was simply strong and kind, a man who worked harder than most. But the stories grew, and in growing, they made him more than a man, a symbol of strength in a land that demanded it. Equally enduring were the ghost stories told by settlers and children. The Lady in White was one of them, a woman said to wander riverbanks, her dress glowing faintly, her cries like lullabies. Parents warned children not to follow her, for she lured them into the current. Some said she was the spirit of a mother who drowned with her child, condemned to search forever. Others claimed she was the embodiment of the river itself, merciless and eternal. Her story shifted with every telling, but the fear it planted was the same. Rivers gave life, but they also took it, and the Lady in White was their messenger. Among the native nations, stories carried power deeper still. The Lakota told of White Buffalo Calf Woman, who brought them the sacred pipe and taught them prayers that connected earth and sky. To see a white buffalo calf was to witness a miracle, a reminder of balance between people and land. Settlers, hearing this, sometimes dismissed it as superstition. Yet when, in rare years, a white calf was born, even the most hardened cowboys felt a hush, as though the land itself was breathing. There were also tales born from the cruel hand of survival. Families spoke of skinwalkers in Navajo lands, witches who could take the shape of animals, moving swift as wolves, eyes glowing in darkness. Travelers swore they saw coyotes that walked like men, or owls that spoke their names. Fear of the skinwalker kept many inside after dusk, and even today, the stories linger in whispers, half believed and wholly feared. But folklore was not only about spirits or giants. It was also about the small, the tender, the human. There were stories of lost children led home by mysterious lights, of widows who found bread left at their doors though no neighbor confessed, stories of coins appearing in boots on Christmas morning, of strangers who vanished after giving a word of comfort. These tales gave shape to kindness in a world where kindness was scarce. Perhaps the greatest legend was the West itself. To those who lived it, the frontier was harsh and bloody, but to those who told its stories afterward, it became larger, brighter, more noble. Cowboys were braver, women sterner, children wiser, outlaws darker, heroes purer. In truth, the West was mud and hunger, but in memory it became gold and glory. Folklore polished the grit into diamonds, leaving behind a mythology that still gleams today. And so, around fires under endless stars, people kept telling stories. Stories of riders without faces, of minds that sang, of rivers haunted by mothers, of buffalo born white as snow, stories of giants and ghosts, heroes and thieves, miracles and warnings. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry strong enough to shelter those who listened. The frontier was hard, but its legends softened the edges, gave meaning to loss, and lit the dark. The West did not end with a bang, nor with a single moment that men could point to. It faded as firewood fades to embers, as a song fades to silence. Railroads carved across the plains. Barbed wire closed the open range. Telegraph poles carried voices faster than horses ever could. Towns grew into cities, cabins into streets lined with lamps, prairies into fields measured and fenced. The wilderness that once seemed endless was measured, mapped, and tamed. Yet in that taming, something vanished, not just wildness, but a way of life built on struggle and hope. Those who had lived the old days remembered with both pride and pain. Cowboys, once kings of the trail, found themselves laborers on fenced ranches. Prospectors who had chased gold wandered into old age with empty hands. Native nations, whose stories had sung across the plains for centuries, were pushed onto reservations, their voices silenced by law and hunger. Farmers traded oxen for steel plows, wagons for trains, lanterns for electric bulbs. Progress was celebrated, but it also buried memories beneath brick and iron. And yet, the frontier did not die. It transformed. What was once lived became legend. Families told stories of their ancestors who had crossed rivers with nothing but a cart, who had buried children and still planted seed, who had faced blizzards and bandits and hunger and still endured. Around tables, in schools, in books, the West was reborn, not as it was, but as it was remembered. Memory polished hardship into heroism, suffering into sacrifice, mud into myth. There was an old cowboy named Josiah Reed, who lived long enough to see trains thunder where once he had driven cattle. His grandchildren begged him for stories, and he told them of nights when the stars burned so sharp they felt like knives, of stampedes that shook the earth, of friends who never came back. When asked if he missed those days, he smiled and said, "I miss the men I rode with." The land was hard, but they made it worth writing. His words lived on long after he was gone, passed from lips to lips, until even strangers knew the tales. Others, too, left behind echoes. The granddaughter of Anna Muller, who once laid toys on her children's graves, grew up to write poems about the strength of mothers. The chapel of Henry Brooks, the miner who saw visions in the dark, still stood, its cracked bell ringing faintly when winds blew. The legend of the willow woman Clara Weston lived on in local songs, praising her for finding water in a land of dust. In these fragments, the West survived, not as a place on maps, but as a place in hearts. Even the land itself carried memory. Fields once soaked with blood grew wheat that fed cities. Rivers that had swallowed wagons now powered mills. Trails carved by wagon wheels became highways. And yet, in the stillness of night, when coyotes howled and winds raced across grass, one could almost hear the Old West breathing, alive in echoes. The folklore never faded. Campfire tales became dime novels. Dime novels became movies. Movies became legends told across the world. The Ghost Rider still gallops in stories. The Lady in White still weeps by rivers. Big Jack still bends horseshoes in children's imaginations. The frontier that ended in soil was